Well, good morning, Living Hope, and good morning, Madison. It's great to be back with you again, and eventually, no, not eventually, next week, we are gathering in person again. And we could not be more excited and looking forward to seeing you all again and being back gathered with one voice. So next week, 9:30 a.m. at Living Hope Church, we will be back gathering in person. We're really looking forward to it. Obviously, things will be a little bit different, so just expect that. Expect it to be a little different. Maybe as you go, just get your mind and heart ready for that. But we'll be gathered together. We'll sing a couple songs together. We'll have the teaching together, and we'll grow together. We're really excited about that. But along those lines, as we gather again and we get together face to face, we're in need of some ministry partners. That's what we call our volunteers. So if you are available and if you're willing, obviously we do have a couple of specific guidelines now that are a little different than what they normally are. But if you have some time and some willingness to be a ministry partner and partner with us at offering hope to this community and to our world, we'd love to get connected with you. Send us an email, office@lhwc.org. Until then, today, we got a one-off series I'm really excited about. We're going to be talking about how to enjoy getting beat up. I don't know about you, but I don't enjoy it, and I don't think you probably do either. But how can we? And I think the Paul has a lot to say about this. So here we go. We're going to talk about how to enjoy getting beat up, and we will see you next week.
Well, good morning. I am so happy that you joined us today. My name is Pastor Kirby. I am one of the pastors here at Living Hope. I don't know about you, but I'm not a fan of pain. I don't enjoy getting hurt, physically, emotionally, mentally. I don't enjoy suffering. In fact, I've been in exactly 1.5 fights in my entire life. Both of them were in elementary school, so we all know they were for very serious reasons, right? But when we think of a fight or a struggle, we think of a constant effort to stay up and conquer your opponent. Paul had a similar struggle. But unlike most of us, including myself, he was not ashamed to admit that he had struggles in his life. And we're going to see that Paul actually kind of enjoyed getting beat up. He didn't look at the struggle or his suffering as something to lament about or to moan about. And so today I want to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and we're going to go through verses 1 through 10. Okay? And we're going to read that together in just a moment. But leading up to this section, we're going to read, Paul talks about the sufferings he's endured on behalf of Christ. And he's going to show how God is taking care of him, which takes us to the point where Paul starts talking about the gifts that God has given him and his struggle with them. So today I'm going to be reading from the ESV translation, and so let's do this. Let's read this together. Verse 1. I must go on boasting, though there is nothing to be gained by it. I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast except for my weaknesses. Though, if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I will refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. So to keep me from being conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weaknesses. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with my weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Now, the first part of this passage is a little odd in a sense, right? He's talking about himself in the third person. He says, I know a man. He's talking about himself. And he talks about the visions that God has given him. So we see that Paul has a gift from God in the area of teaching and prophesying. But I want to focus on the second half of this passage. Starting in verse 6, we see that what the reason was for telling us about his gifts. He has the right to boast for the things that he's done. And he would be justified in doing that. However, he chooses not to for the reasons that he doesn't want people to have an elevated idea of who he is. He wants them to know about him from what they see and hear from him. This is what Paul wanted to avoid. He wanted people to know him for who he was and nothing more. So here's where it gets difficult. All right, let's look at this in verse 7. Paul says this, so to keep me from being conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from being conceited. So we see Paul recognizing his own weaknesses. He recognizes that he had the capacity to become conceited with all that was happening in him and all that was happening through him and the lives that were being changed through his ministry. I don't know, but when I think of Paul from the Bible, I don't think conceited is the term I'd use. But he apparently struggled with those thoughts, or at least recognized his capacity to do so. See, this whole passage reminds me a great deal of Job and what God allowed to happen in his life. We notice that God is the indirect form of testing. Satan has to function within the limits of what God allows. See, too often we say, God, why are you doing this to me? See, but know this, God does not test or torment you. Okay, look what it says in James chapter 1, verses 13 through 15. And remember, when you are being tempted, do not say, God is tempting me. God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entices us and drags us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions. And when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. See, it's not God tempting us. At the same time, we often hear that statement, that one we love to say, that God will never give us more than we can handle, which is not true. And it's a misunderstanding of what Paul said in 1 Corinthians. And we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But now there are a couple different views on what that thorn was in Paul's side that he talks about. Some say it was this internal spiritual struggle with a sin, right? Others will say it's a physical ailment along the lines of vision issues, which hindered his ministry in a profound way. No matter what the thorn was, the outcome is the exact same. The outcome is that Paul had to completely rely on God's grace to get through it. Now, this idea feeds straight into the question of why do bad things happen to good people? I don't know if anyone would deny the fact that Paul was a good person. He did so many incredible things, and one could easily argue that he didn't deserve this thorn, no matter what it was. But we see that there's something in his life that he struggles with, something that he believes that if it were removed from him and from his life and from his ministry, all of that would be worlds better and more effective. Have you ever thought that or prayed that? That, God, why do I struggle with this? Or why do I have so much hurt? Can't you just take it away? Why would you want to see me struggle? I've prayed that a lot. I've prayed that on many occasions. I've prayed that recently. That God would remove the struggle from my life. Just for me to turn around and do the exact same thing, or turn around and face the same struggles and the same hurt again. It's so frustrating. It's so painful. It's so hurtful. Paul thought the same thing. He says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. Now, the 3 times isn't telling us, hey, pray 3 times. If you don't get an answer, just give up. Right? It's not saying that. What it shows is that Paul's perseverance in prayer. Not just on the fervency of prayer, it's a continual request and dependence on God for help. Let me ask you a question. What are the times that we as people tend to pray? When are the times that generally we ask God for something? When we need something, right? When we need help, when we want something. See, this thorn in Paul's life forces Paul to recognize the area in his life that's difficult, and he has to completely rely on God. When you think of your prayers, how much of them are spent on what you need, what you want? God, give me health. God, give me wisdom. God, help me get out of debt. God, take this sickness away. God, remove this struggle from my life. Now, let me ask you this question. How much of your prayers are asking God what He wants? What is He going to do? See, here's the hard part to understand. The world we live in is not God's plan A for us. I don't even know if I'm convinced that it's so much of His plan B either, but within that plan, contrary to popular belief, it's not God's will for us to always triumph in this life, both in terms of healing and spiritual power and wealth and everything else. That leads us to ask that eternal question, well, if it's not to triumph, what is God's will? Simply put, God's will is for us to draw closer to Him. It's not for us to always succeed. Look what it says in 1 John chapter 5, verses 14 and 15. And we are confident that He hears us whenever we ask for anything that pleases Him. And since we know He hears us when we make our requests, we also know that He will give us what we ask for. That added part, a whole new depth for me. It added a whole new depth as I was preparing this week. If God's will is for me to draw close to Him in everything that happens in my life, there will be times that flat out stink. And I have to say that I really don't like that. I don't. I mean, come on, God, I follow you, right? And I call myself the professional Christian because I'm paid to do this. And God, I come to you always, even when times are great, right? Anyone else ever thought that? But then how do we fail to draw close to Him when things are going just as planned? All the time. Besides, God didn't do it. I did. I'm not thinking of God right now. Things are great. Rather, just how good my life is going. Life is going great. I don't think about God at those times. But God's will is for us to draw closer to Him in both good and bad. Now that helps us to understand God's answer to Paul, because God's answer is actually a negative one. He doesn't answer the request directly or answer it like we would want. Or in this case, He doesn't answer it how Paul wanted. But He answered. What does God say? God says, no. God says, no, I will not take away your pain or your suffering. In fact, God says, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. You see, what typically happens when we get a negative response or a difficult circumstance in life, we complain profusely. We find someone or something else to blame. We give up on God thinking He doesn't like us, He doesn't care about us, and we say, God is distant, right? Or we continue the request until we get the response we desire, or we give up completely. But look at how Paul responds here when God says no. In verse 9 it says this, but He said to me, my grace is sufficient sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weaknesses. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Wow. I don't know about you, but I don't exactly boast about being weak or having a struggle. But I think the key word here is sufficient. Okay? Now the definition, according to the dictionary, of sufficient means this. It means it's enough or adequate. So when my kids want more ice cream, but they've already had a couple of scoops, I tell them, you've had enough. Maybe I should start telling them that what they've had is, that's sufficient, right? I mean, I'm going to sound pretty fancy on that, right? God says His grace is sufficient. His grace is enough. His grace is adequate. But in our American culture, adequate is never good enough. We push to have more, to have the best grades, to not settle with good enough. Rather, to always strive for the best. So when God tells us that His grace is enough for us, it kind of grates on us a little bit. I mean, I want God to lavish it out on me. I want it in abundance. If that grace is enough, it had better. It has to be better if we have more, right? If it's enough, more is always better. But what if we accepted that God's grace will actually sustain us? That God's grace is good. That more is not necessary. But our culture tells us we need large plates of food. We need a buffet. We need so much of something that we don't even have the chance of not having enough. I don't know about you, one of my favorite shows as a kid growing up was the show Home Improvement. And then the main character, Tim, he had this phrase that says, needs more power, and do that whole grunting thing, right? We have this belief that we need more. But God's reminding Paul and us that what He gives us is actually adequate, is actually enough to sustain us. Paul had an understanding of that word. He gladly accepts the answer from God because he was fully aware that the divine grace will be more than enough for him to cope with his thorn. And that gives him a reason to boast. Not his visions from God, not his ministry from God, not the things that he's able to do, but rather the power that God gives. In 1993, there was a great movie called Schindler's List. And this is a wonderful movie based on a true story which tells of Oskar Schindler, a member of the Nazi Party who saved the lives of more than 1,000 Jews during the Holocaust. In this movie, Oskar Schindler is confronted with the concept that if you have control, then you have power. However, Schindler's told that he's told from one of his companions that the Jewish people feared the Nazi because the Nazis were able to kill them at will. But Schindler wisely recognized that that's not power. He says this, he says that power is when we have every justification to kill and we do not. Power is when we have every justification to do something, but we don't do it. Schindler got it. It's not the ability to take a life and take control, rather it's to let go and save. When we let go of our thorn to Christ and rely on His grace, we will see His power all the more, which Paul says, therefore I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest on me. See, the idea of power stated here actually describes a shelter for us. It's a shelter for us given to us by God. A shelter protects, right? That's what God is doing. He's protecting. That's power. But Kirby, my pain is so intense, my sin is so ugly. You know what? You're not alone. We all have pain. All of us have an ugly sin. We all have family personal struggles. What did we say the will of God was? That everything would draw us closer to Him. We're not talking about warm, fuzzy feelings here, but rather an utter dependence on Him to weep, to scream, to celebrate, to struggle, to question, all of those with our thorns with God. Our weaknesses demand us to rely on God alone and not ourselves. So often we say, I can do it. You know, that good old-fashioned American determination and will, right? Or our stubbornness. Our stubbornness not to let anybody know we have struggles. Even sometimes we try to hide them. Sometimes even try to hide them from God. We hide behind this false pretense that we would just be burdening others with our problems. I can handle it. Let's not kid ourselves here. Life hurts. It's hard. God is telling us not to do it alone. In fact, we can't. And that is what gave Paul the strength to be content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. He's strong because of the power of Christ and His grace in our lives. And did you notice how his thoughts and his prayers have made the switch? He's no longer praying for the sin or the suffering and the difficulty to be removed. Rather, he's accepting it. Because God will now be seen in his life even more. So often we think grace is the means of salvation, and that's it. For the beginning of our Christian journey, from there on out, we don't really need it anymore. Not at all. See, but the truth is, God's grace is needed and given to us at all times. Then we will see the incredible power of God in our lives. So does life give us more than we can handle? Absolutely. We have more than we can ever handle. So in order that we can rely on God, if we follow ourselves to submit to his will and recognize that it's so we can draw closer to him, then we can do just as Paul did. We can celebrate getting beat up. Maybe you're there today. Maybe you're just tired. Maybe you're beat up and worn out. Maybe you're wondering where God is. You're not alone. You're not alone. Reach out to us, office@lhwc.org. Write in the comments section. I believe they're right over there. Contact us. Let us know how we can pray for you. Let us know how we can help. You're not alone. And God's grace and his power is going to be made perfect and shine through your life, through those pains. There's a great song by a band I love, and it says, wounds is where the light shines through. Our wounds let the light of Christ shine for the world around us, and his power is going to be made perfect in you. So today, rest in that grace, rest in his power, even those things in your life that are hard. God bless you. Go in grace today.